Wachiyanka. Leopituwashni. Hello, cousins. It's really good to see you. This is a good day. I begin our discussion this evening with my disclaimer. I welcome you in Lakota, but I do not claim to be a fluent Lakota speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you regarding indigeneity and social justice. As we begin this evening, I'd like to express gratitude that we are all here together at this moment and at this place and at this time as we seek to improve society, to highlight the significance that we all matter, and to heal wounds through corrective action on some scale. For this reason, we must be aware that to attack each other in some way is to hurt our collective cause, to inhibit our efforts, to prolong what we seek, which is change. To this, I offer the Lakota prayer, Madakuya Wasu. We're all related, or I am related to all that is. I want to also preface our discussion with the acknowledgement that there are good people of all types, regardless of skin, regardless of religion, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of those things that some people use to separate us, to keep us apart. We are all family. Anytime you get family together, it's a good day. I tell you these things because during our talk this evening, I'm going to refer to the color white in some ways. But you must understand that the term white is used in some circles to refer to anyone not considered Native American. So it doesn't matter what your skin color is. If you're not Native American, you're considered white. And that includes some Native Americans. We might all know the stories of Thanksgiving, Pocahontas, and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, these stories are part of America's history, the legendary myth-making of our great nation. But for the next hour, I'd like to provide you an opportunity to see things from a different perspective. Tonight, we're going to discuss the interesting details behind the supplanting of the Native American myth with that of the United States. We're going to talk about the destruction of indigenous peoplehood using the Western colonial model. And we'll look at current events that reveal how little some things have changed. I'll also share some stories of positive steps tribes have taken to reclaim language and culture and to protect the land and to strengthen indigenous identity. So with that, let's look at some images in relation to what I just mentioned. And then I'd like to take a minute to discuss each of these. I want to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay. So this first image is Thanksgiving. It's entitled First Thanksgiving, 1621. It was painted in 1899 by Gene Ferris. Now, the tribe of Indians encountered by the Pilgrims and represented in this painting was the Wampanoag. Immediately, I'd like to point out that the style of clothing that the Wampanoag are depicted herein is not what they wore. That is what Plains Indians wore. Now, while this image symbolizes what's become a great day of Thanksgiving across the country, the truth is unfortunately much darker. Shortly after Europeans began showing up along the coastline, disease swept through the Northeast, killing large amounts of the population. That depopulation allowed colonists to settle and expand much easier, and within 50 years of their arrival, colonial depredations against the Wampanoag led to what many people call King Philip's War. The Native American, the chief, was Metacom. He was Christianized Philip, and that's why in the history that you might be familiar with, this is called King Philip's War. But he was never a king. He was a chief. In the war, King Philip's War, or Metacom, in which nearly half the existing tribe was destroyed, surviving males were sold into slavery in the West Indies. Many of the women and children went into slavery in New England and elsewhere. King Philip himself, or Metacom, died in the final battle. And the colonists beheaded him, and they put his head on a pike so that anybody walking into the Plymouth colony for the next 25 years would see Metacom's head on pike. And that was the lesson that the Wampanoags learned. So this next image is the image of Pocahontas rescuing John Smith from purported Indian treachery. You may or may not be aware that Smith was quite a storyteller. It's well documented that he had a tendency to exaggerate, to put it mildly. To this point, the Smith's recounting of events in dealing with the Powhatan, I'm going to paraphrase it, but Smith himself writes, he was stuffed with food, and again I'm paraphrasing, he was stuffed with food, and then he was said to be executed by the treacherous Indians, but he was saved by Pocahontas. Now interestingly, from a Native American perspective, this doesn't make any sense. Customs are not that you invite a guest in, you fatten them up, and then you surprisingly turn on them and kill them. Thank you. The manner Smith described in his method of execution, in fact, wasn't even part of a woodland tribal practice, according to anthropologist Helen Roundtree, an honorary member of the Nansemond and Upper Mattapony tribes. More to the point, specifically related to the rescue, what you might find interesting is that Smith didn't discuss this dramatic rescue by Pocahontas until 6 years after, when he was trying to publish his work as a book. Even more interesting, Captain Smith had also used a very similar rescue story, some might call a literary device, when describing his rather unbelievable tales of action and intrigue as a slave to the Turkish princess Chagabegzanda, who protected him prior to his escape from her brutal brother. So finally, let's take a quick look at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer met his end. Prior to Little Bighorn, there was a battle of Washita River, in which Custer used Cheyenne women and children as shields to thwart an attack against his own cavalry. He actually documents this in his own autobiography of why he does this and uses human shields. After the battle, Custer smoked a peace pipe with the Cheyenne, and he promised to never again fight them. To that very promise, a Cheyenne by the name of Stone Forehead dumped the ashes of the peace pipe into Custer's boots without him even realizing it, thus basically sealing that promise. But 2 years later, after the Battle of Washita River, as Custer was attempting to move against an Indian village near Little Bighorn, he was met head-on by thousands of warriors from numerous plains tribes, including the Cheyenne. So it's been said that due to a brief relationship Custer had with a young Cheyenne woman, which some say he even fathered a son with her, which some Native Americans' customs consider this a marriage, this kind of relationship. Custer was considered family by the Cheyenne. So after the battle, 2 Cheyenne women are surveying the battlefield, and they came across Custer's body. They prevented any desecration of that body by claiming his corpse as family. But the 2 Cheyenne women who were in Washita and knew of Custer's promise to the Cheyenne 2 years earlier, which he broke, decided to stick awls in his ears so he could hear his own words better in the next life. And Native American women would carry awls with them. They repaired teepees, moccasins, clothing, you name it. So they always had these on them. But to ensure that he could listen better to his own promise, they stuck those awls in his ears. So I wanted to share these stories with you because I think it's important to consider that there's always more to any given story than what we're told. I also want to root these stories as examples that occurred under a process called the Western Colonial Model. The Western Colonial Model is a process that describes one culture's efforts to assimilate another culture. Our discussion this evening will juxtapose the Western Colonial Model with the Peoplehood Model developed by Tom Holm et al. As a way of identifying past devastation to tribal identity. So let me briefly describe the tenets of the Western Colonial Model. The first tenet is dispossession or disruption as the colonizer gains territory. I hope that's the word that you're seeing right now. Yeah, okay. And these resources oftentimes through acts of coercion, such as gift giving, that create doubt as to the intent of the colonizer. Part of the dispossession or the disruption strategy includes the sanctioning of indigenous intermediaries who act as a buffer between the two groups. This person or group often becomes the recognized political body by the dominant society. And as such, a relationship can disrupt traditional practices as a newly recognized intermediary continues to gain power. The second is restriction. As soon as I find it. There we go. Does that say restriction?
Yes.
Fantastic. The second is restriction, imposed by the colonizer through the use of treaties and geographical boundaries in an attempt to regain order. The third is acculturation or assimilation, in which the colonizer attempts to change indigenous culture through coercion and force. Acculturation or assimilation also creates dependency through cultural changes by replacing traditional practices with new ones that leads to control by the colonizer. When the colonizer realizes that assimilation doesn't work, and the fourth tenet is enacted, it's accommodation. The group in power accommodates particular demands of the colonized in the form of particular legislation and the validation of language, religion, and culture. However, this phase does not recognize the full inherent sovereignty of these groups. Rather, it mollifies resistance through partial accommodation in the system. Decolonization follows as the fifth tenet in the Western colonial model as indigenous people seek to take back their power. And the final element, the model of neocolonialism, is marked by the fact that while the indigenous people do possess some power, they are economically controlled by the dominant society. The Western colonial model works to systematically override the sovereign status of a people, and it can be seen as the antithesis to the peoplehood model. The peoplehood model is what I used in my dissertation, and we're going to talk a little bit about that momentarily. The peoplehood model is based on the pioneering work of anthropologists Edward H. Spicer and Robert K. Thomas. This model, refined by Tom Holm, J. Diane Pearson, and Ben Chavez, dynamically links language, place, ceremony, and history as factors as a complete organic system that accounts for particular social, cultural, political, economic, and ecological behaviors exhibited by groups of people in particular territories. The collective people retaining these factors necessarily possess inherent sovereignty, and they maintain their identity even as colonialism misrecognizes them or their culture evolves. These two models, and in a very simple explanation, the peoplehood model describes Indianness, and the Western colonial model is a methodology employed to destroy Indianness. So as we continue on this evening, keep those two thoughts in mind. So, now that the groundwork's been laid for the discussion this evening, let's situate the contents of the two papers that you read as background within the subject of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, the challenges they've faced, just like other Native American tribes, and their quest for full federal recognition. I say full federal recognition because although the Lumbee have been identified as Indians by the federal government, they've not ever received any benefits of that acknowledgement as a tribe. The current federal recognition process also does not acknowledge colonialism or that impact. Because of this denial by the federal government, the Lumbee have had to define themselves in ways desired by the federal government, but not necessarily as the Lumbee see themselves and their sacred histories. This is due in part to how non-indigenous people, specifically the federal government, do not understand or recognize indigenous thinking models. The importance of indigenous thinking models can be seen in Gerald Bisner's Fugitive Poses, as he tells the story of a court case that offers an intriguing perspective of the comparison between the story told in the traditional Anishinaabe manner through visual memories to the veneration of civilized man's words. The story I'm about to tell also intersects with Scott Lyon's article, Actual Existing Indian Nations, as it pertains to the destruction of wild rice beds. After listening to Ovid, an elderly Anishinaabe, provide testimony in the traditional manner, relaying how old John Squirrel, now deceased, was present when the U.S. government promised the Anishinaabe that they would always control their wild rice harvest, the judge responded that the court could not accept the evidence provided because it was based on the sayings of a dead man. "John Squirrel's dead," said Judge Miles Lord, "and you can't say what a dead man said." The judge waited for his words to be translated, then invited the witness to continue his story. Ovid turned brusquely in his witness chair, bothered by what the judge said about John Squirrel. Ovid wore spectacles with thick lenses, and he squinted as he leaned in towards the judge. He pointed at the legal books on the bench, and then he shouted that those books contained the stories of dead white men. "Why should I believe what a white man says when you don't believe John Squirrel?" After Ovid's words were translated, the judge acknowledged. "Well, you got me there." The story of John Squirrel is an example of indigenous ways of thinking that were initially questioned as valid, authentic models of knowledge, only to later be accepted by non-natives. And in a similar way, I seek to have the elements of peoplehood accepted by non-natives as a means of understanding indigenous society. Let's go back and take a look at the tenets of peoplehood and discuss each of those for just a second. We'll begin first with language. In 1492, Spanish scholar Antonio de Nebrija completed the first grammar of the Castilian language, underscoring to Queen Isabella that language was always the companion of empire. That same year, and upon his first encounter with Native Americans, Christopher Columbus wrote that he'd take several members from an indigenous population he encountered back to Spain so they may learn to speak. Now, certainly the people Columbus captured spoke a language, but Columbus was inferring was that they didn't speak Castilian, which was elevated to a lingua franca. The deployment of the victor's language to exert colonial control has prevailed for centuries. It is reflected again in the writings of Gregorio Garcia in 1607, as he explained how the devil had confounded the work of God by creating languages for the Indians. As late as 1887, U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Atkins invoked the conqueror's prerogative to justify linguistic repression in North America. If the Indians were in Germany or France or any other colonized country, civilized country, they should be instructed in the language they're used. No unity or community of feeling can be established among the different peoples unless they're brought to speak the same language and thus become imbued with like ideas of duty. Now, of course, the perspective of Atkins, Garcia, and others reflects a lack of understanding that replacing language does not ensure like ideas. The conqueror's prerogative to impose the language upon subject populations has prevailed for centuries, and the misapprehension that indigenous populations possessed, at best, very defective languages was perpetuated in much of the poetry and the prose of colonial America and the early republic. Atkins claimed that enforced linguistic homogeneity was essential for the business of the country. And this exemplified the United States government's long-standing imperial attitude in dealing with Native Americans. Commissioner Atkins' argument that Native Americans must be forced to speak and think like the colonizer confirms Antonio de Nebrija's observation that language was always the companion of empire. And it reveals the tacit recognition that language is a sign of a people's sovereignty and their claim to the land they inhabit. In order to establish dominion over the conquered peoples and their territories, the United States, following the example of the European imperial powers, employed the Western colonial model. In his report to the President of the United States, Commissioner Taylor summed up the findings of the Indian Peace Commission on January 7, 1868, noting, "The Indian was found on the Atlantic seaboard, and thence to the Rocky Mountains lived numerous distinct tribes, each speaking a language as incomprehensible to the other as was our language to any of them. Now, of course, Taylor's perspective was completely incorrect, since Native Americans had had complex trade networks for centuries, and they frequently connected with people of other languages, and they managed to do business. And I'm going to offer an apology really quickly, because you'll notice all my narrative voices of white guys sounds relatively the same. Taylor acknowledged that as the space between Native Americans and non-indigenous people began to shrink, it became evident the land must be shared between the white and the Indian, or one of the two must yield it. Well, it was self-evident that the whites had no intention of abandoning the land, any more than Taylor recognized the ability of the indigenous cultures to coexist and communicate with them. More to the point, under the Western colonial model, there was no intent by the federal government to pursue any course of action other than the dispossession of the tribes, the restriction of their movement, and their demise or assimilation into American society. Taylor explained the three factors for these conflicts between Native Americans and dominant society. The first, these are his words, the antipathy of race. Second, the difference of customs and manners arising from their tribal or clannish organizations. And third, the difference in language, which is a great measure barred intercourse and a proper understanding of each other's motives and intentions. Now, to resolve the Indian problem, the nation would have to take a broad approach towards assimilation. Echoing earlier Spanish advocates of linguistics, Taylor advised President Andrew Johnson that by educating Native American children in the English language, civilization would take hold and all difference on this point of agitation would disappear. Taylor believed that through the sameness of language is produced the sameness of sentiment and thought. By blotting out the barbaric dialects of Native Americans and substituting them with English, Taylor argued that no less than 2/3 of the problems with the Indians would just go away. So as a result, by requiring all Native Americans to utilize English, the distinction between the tribes would disappear, and they would fuse into one homogeneous mass. Between 1835 and 1887, there were no formal schools available to the Lumbee, and their language underwent few lexical, semantic, grammatical, and phonetic changes. Because of this lack of outside influence, idioms particular to the Lumbee have continued to exist, including such phrases as on the swamp to describe the Lumbee neighborhood, a brick house Indian, which refers to an Indian of privilege, sorry in the world, identifying that one is not doing well, or a Juvember, which is a slingshot. In 1879, the off-reservation Indian school system had begun operations at the Carlisle Barracks, as well as other locations. And Native American children were being sent there by the federal government for purposes of education and assimilation. In few instances, participation was voluntary, but David Wallace Adams describes in large part attendance was accomplished through threats, bribery, fraud, persuasion, and force. Those students who did not assimilate often ran away, and once they were caught, they were often punished by strappings, confinement, and public humiliation. In some instances, those who misbehaved were literally declared insane, and they were sent to the Canton Asylum for Insane Indians, which is in South Dakota, where, as Todd Leahy explains, there were but few ways for inmates to leave: escape or death. Dr. Harry Hummer, the asylum superintendent, cited over 1,400 reports from various Indian schools of children suffering some mental malady, which he later indicated was due to their Indian culture and their Indian lifestyles. During a House of Representatives review in February 1913, a member of the Committee on Indian Affairs questioned why the Lumbee, who had previously attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial Institute, did not want to participate in the school system any longer. Special Indian Agent McPherson reported to the committee that, well, the Lumbee are too poor to do so. And besides, these non-reservation Indians, these schools don't furnish precisely the character of training the Lumbee desired. Now, of course, the purported main objection of the Lumbee community was that the non-reservation school system was deficient in providing the training the Lumbeys sought. But it also required that the children be removed from the cultural and linguistic influences of the family and the tribe. It forbade the expression of their own native identity and simultaneously reinforced the culture and language of the dominant society. The expectations and the limitations based on language ensured the eradication of all languages other than the Anglo-Americanization of 19th century variants of Lumbee English specifically, since any use of an indigenous tongue meant swift and sometimes deadly punishment. Now, one example of the punishment meted out to Native Americans in general is recounted by Indian school system teacher Minnie Jenkins, where she, and these are her words, I'm not even going to try to emulate that speech, so I'm just going to read it. Minnie Jenkins once said that, "I once had 35 Mojave kindergartners lie like sardines across tables, and I had them spanked for speaking Mojave." The Merriam Report of 1928 further captured the more severe pitfalls of the school system by noting that boarding schools only fed the children in their care for pennies on the dollar and far below what was necessary to maintain good health. In this way, the Indian Service education system was literally a starved service. As part of the federal government's design to ensure that only the widely accepted standard American English was spoken, many methods were deployed to kill the Indian in him and save the man. Part of the reformative process taught the school system allowed boys to only speak English as they received instruction in mandated tradecraft. They were then put to work wagon building, shoemaking, tinsmithing, carpentry, painting, tailoring, and harness making. Now, all of these generated profits for the school system. Students caught speaking anything other than proper English were punished by public whippings, lashes, and forcible confinement for days. Navajo Bernice Levchuk recalls that boys and girls were prevented from returning home for years on end or were physically abused with beatings and maltreatment severe enough that in one case it ripped a student's ear. Many students were assigned to patrons who withheld medical care, kept personal items from the students, and required exhausting manual labor by instilling fear in the children through cruel and unconscionable practices. And I'll comment, too, that they were assigned to these families because, and it's no slight against any religion, the good Christian families were going to teach them how to be good Christians. Even more disturbing, the burden of evidence indicates that more forcible sexual assault has been perpetrated on Aboriginal children than on any of the young people of almost any other nation. Philip McDermott tells us that language is inherently linked to issues of power and identity. This is poignant since the United States government sought to eradicate the languages and cultures of the indigenous populations in order to force the departure from tribal identity and marshal the various people of the country under a national one. More to the point, it's the deliberate effort by the government to invalidate cultural sovereignty and exterminate Native American identity through the dismemberment of peoplehood. But the later recognition provided to Native Americans by the same government has proven to be a hugely controversial topic, not simply because of the cost, but also because of the problems that it poses to notions of equal citizenship. America's indigenous population wasn't officially granted U.S. citizenship until 1924. And even then, they weren't afforded status as Americans or provided equal access to education, employment, and health care, or more. Equal participation in a culture must provide its members with meaningful ways of life across the wide range of human activities, including social, educational, religious, recreational, and economic life, encompassing both public and private spheres. So the second characteristic of peoplehood I'd like to discuss is sacred history. A Lakota story tells of a time when the world was new, and Onteki, the water monster, caused a great flood by fighting with people as the water rose and it violently consumed everything in its path, causing the people to cling to lands above the water. But soon it too began disappearing. As the people were dashed between the water and the land, Wambi Gleshka spotted eagle, flew overhead and plucked one woman from the carnage by letting her hold on to his feet. As he held tightly, he flew away to the highest point of the Black Hills, the only land that remained above the water. Eagle married the girl, and they produced children, who, as the water receded, returned to the land to repopulate the Lakota Oyate nation. And that is how the Lakota Oyate became a great nation, an eagle nation. And for this reason, its people still wear the eagle plume. The origin of the Lakota as the Eagle Nation people is an example of how sacred history defines identity. The sacred history of a tribe, as Tom Holm explains, contains the origin, creation, migration, and other stories important to its people. Sacred history may outline the emergence or descendants into this world, sometimes from previously destroyed worlds. This has been attributed to the different ages of the earth, like that of the Dine. Or they include migration stories like that of the Lumbee. Origin and migration stories are two different explanations that identify how people came to identify themselves, their homeland, and why a land is sacred to them. Often this information comes from the sacred beings, from prophecies and dreams that are an important source of reliable information, and they must be obeyed. Joseph Campbell describes these stories as an organization of symbolic images and narratives, metaphorical of the possibilities of human experience and the fulfillment of a given culture at a given time. Sacred history, as an aspect of peoplehood, underscores and continually refines the ontology, the epistemology, and the axiology of a people. Combined, these elements inform identity that, as Hilarion Weaver points out, comes under fire when outsiders attempt to define identity or reduce it to a single aspect of peoplehood. And it's exactly this action of coming under fire and of outsiders defining peoplehood, the bedrock of sovereignty, that is at the heart of the Lumbee situation vis-a-vis the ongoing acceptance and rejection of inherent identity as a tribe by the federal government. Ontologically, sacred history presents ways of thinking about the world. It helps shape the indigenous worldview, encompassing the relationship between human beings, animals, the land, plants. This relationship often results in clan names and tribal affiliations to particular beings, such as the Eagle Nation of the Lakota or the Bitterwater clan of the Dine. Sacred history uses stories to explain how humans came to separate and speak their own languages from other beings, illustrating human evolution, but continue to respect that link to the beginnings when humans were all one, as found in the explanation of the Six Nations tribes. The combination of colonial processes and the Western cultural supposition that Western history signifies authentic history work to undermine the validity of Lumbee sacred history. While there are numerous migration stories about how the Lumbee arrived in the current homeland, Robeson and nearby counties in North Carolina, their indigenous stories have been supplanted by the official Anglo-American histories of settlement and migration. And these official narratives of how European settlers created and civilized a nation on supposedly virgin American soil have long been propagated in the U.S. educational system. Tellingly, though, they, by and large, omit that U.S. nation building commanded the planned destruction of indigenous populations. This reminds me, a few years ago when I came to residency, we took a trip over to the city of Cincinnati, docent who wanted to tell us about the origin of Cincinnati, the city of Cincinnati, this beautiful land. What I found fascinating was that the briefer commented how there were no Native Americans in this area when white man first came to discover this beautiful location. Thought, wow, what a great place for a city. In truth, there were many tribes in this region. I'd like to also note that during the talk on the history of Cincinnati, the docent completely avoided the fact that at the end of the 19th century, there were Native Americans living in the zoo in Cincinnati. They performed, and presumably they did so because it provided a better life for them on their reservation. Now, returning to the discussion of myth. The impact of these predominant U.S. American origin myths on Native Americans has been the systematic denial of their peoplehood that has been historically grounded in sacred history. Taiyaki Alfred and Jeff Corntassel argue that most Americans of European descent follow the mandate provided for them by their imperial forefathers' colonial legacy, not by attempting to eradicate the physical signs of indigenous people as human bodies, but by eradicating their existence as peoples through the erasure of their histories and their geographies that provide the foundation for indigenous cultural identities of sense and self. The displacement of sacred history with colonial history has not only impacted how indigenous people came to be seen as possessing no right of self-determination by non-indigenous peoples, but also how many Native Americans came to perceive themselves as lacking peoplehood. In order for such a dramatic transposition to occur, a calamitous political, economic, social, and cultural force had to be introduced into Native American society. This began as early as 1603 for the indigenous peoples of Virginia and the Carolinas. By 1603, English abduction of Native Americans from Virginia and the Carolinas occurred frequently, and many of these abductees were sold to slave markets into the West Indies and Bermuda. Some Native Americans, like Thomas Kiersey, an 18th century progenitor of contemporary Lumbee from the Wyandot tribe, were indentured. Now, indentured servitude was used by the colonies to remove children from the home. That severs the connection to the family, to the culture, and the language, and replaces it with European perspectives, language, and culture. In time, Europeans also used some tribes to hunt down other tribes and either completely annihilated them or enslaved them, such as the Appalachian tribe that was decimated by European disease, then conquistadors, then slavery, then Spanish acculturation, then colonial Indian warfare, that's an extension of Queen Anne's War, and whose last survivors were absorbed into various tribes, including the Lower Creek, the Yamasee, and the Seminole. Jack Campisi further explains that in what is now the Northeast United States, disease destroyed large segments of the native population in the early 17th century, which resulted further in economic disruption and famine, followed by socio-political disruption. The same destruction played out along the eastern seaboard as tribes came in contact with the Old World, leaving remnants of tribes in its wake. And it's interesting, if you go back and look at some primary texts, how some explorers talk about actually walking into Indian villages and there's nothing but piles of bleached bones and huts. The threats posed by Europeans and the tribes they exploited could certainly influence migration, and along with wars, disease, and indentured servitude that resulted in the loss of ties with home community, explain why tribes like the Hatteras, the Chiraw, the Wyandots, and other Algonquian and Siouan peoples may have coalesced into the Lumbee tribe. The early history of the Lumbee can be illuminatingly juxtaposed with Richard Slotkin's description of the European understanding of history, the development of metaphors to America's non-indigenous myth-making, and the resultant approach to the Indian question. Slotkins explains that the myth-maker and the medium used to transmit it are critical factors to its development and proliferation. For example, the physical and psychological forces influencing early colonial literature included the wilderness and the land, its blending of unmitigated harshness, and the tremendous potential for fertility, the absence of strong European cultures on the borders, the eternal presence of the native people in the woods, dark of skin, seemingly dark of mind, mysterious, bloody, cruel, devil-worshipping. The literature Slotkin describes became the foundation of the American myth, which emerged in contrast to and in competition with Native American myths, and was widely propagated through printed material, both real and imagined historical experiences. The fact that these European American stories appeared in print allowed them to proliferate nationwide and eventually become a set of tacit assumptions on the nature of human experience, on human and divine motivations, on moral values, and on the nature of reality. Given the rise of print culture through the 17th and 18th century, Native American stories, which were passed orally, were devalued as counter to the European perspective. Not only were these stories devalued, but non-native stories and perspectives were elevated, so that much of the real Indian had to possess a percentage of Indian blood to be considered an Indian. The federal government has historically used blood quantum, even when science was ill-equipped for such an argument, to determine Indianness. One early 20th century example of the federal government's use of blood quantum can be found among the Chippewa. This relates to the Lyons article that you read, where the use of blood quantum against the Chippewa in a 1914 case called the United States versus the Nichols Chisholm Lumber Company occurred. The government's definition in this case of mixed blood and full blood were completely incomprehensible to the Chippewa, because to them, someone who's a mixed blood was simply a person who wore pants and a hat. And a full blood was somebody who wore more traditional clothing. As noted by the testimony of Deda Baswash, the blood quantum of either mixed blood or full blood in the eyes of the Chippewa had nothing at all to do with actual blood quantum. In particular case, Alice Herdlecka, accompanied by noted anthropologist Dr. Albert Jenks from the University of Minnesota, performed scientific techniques on the Chippewa to determine how much Indian blood they had in them. This is in the early 20th century during a massive government land fraud scheme. The technique included the analysis of hair and the measurement of feet and hands to determine blood quantum. Because of course you can tell by measuring hands and feet. Jenks even reported that, contrary to popular opinion, the pure Indian has slight, delicate hands and feet, the natural form of people who do little manual labor. In the end, Jenks portrayed the hands of the Chippewa akin to those of aristocrats. He also proclaimed that the Chippewa, their noses are coarse and crudely molded rather than finely chiseled, proposing that there's no typical type of Indian nose. The conclusion of Jenks and Herdlecka would foreshadow some similar conclusions of Dr. Seltzer, who would use many of the same techniques on the Lumbee 3 decades later. But, interestingly cited Lumbee as having nostrils that did not coincide with those of Native Americans. In 1935, John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, wrote a memorandum indicating that under the Wheeler-Howard Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, individual Indians with 1/2 or more Indian blood shall be eligible for federal benefits in the same manner as members of a federally recognized tribe. Now, Collier conceded that determining the percentage of Indian blood is subjective because no scientific proof existed at the time, nor has any legal standard of universal applicability been set up by statute for the determination of who is and who is not an Indian. Where the available evidence is insufficient to establish a degree of blood, the Commission was told to appoint, as a member of the investigative committee of competent physical anthropologists, to examine the applicant. And it was in memo, Collier describes that there's no way to determine blood quantum, and that there's really no law that definitively determines Indianness. So he adopts a methodology that has the force of law, even though he concedes that it's not accurate. It has the force of law to proclaim or deny an indigenous identity. And on April 7th of 1936, Assistant Solicitor Cohen wrote a memorandum regarding the criteria used in determining blood quantum, and that the government must rely on oral evidence. including the enrollment of Indian schools and Indian institutions maintained by the state. So in 1936, Collier sent a team to Robinson County, North Carolina, in that they might determine the blood quantum of the Lumbee. On 2 separate occasions, 209 Lumbee were physically examined using Seltzer's mechanical devices to measure the physical body, and the von Luschen color scale determined skin color. They measured stature and sitting height, arm span, took measurements of the head, facial parts and hands, and the chest, pelvis, and the feet, and they measured the circumference of the head, the body, and the limbs. And then Seltzer, in his own words, scientifically determined the race of all these applicants, concluding that the measurements identified people who possessed 1/2 or more Indian blood, based, his words, based solely on the manifestations of physical appearance, physical characteristics of known racial significance, as, still his words, interpreted by the science of physical and racial anthropology. In one particular diagnosis of a Lumbee female, Seltzer noted the presence of strong Indianoid features, but recorded that she has to possess less than 1/2 Indian blood. In another case, he recognized an Indian as possessing features of an Indian, but then he also made a comment that they must also include Negro and white blood in them. So they were less than 1/2 Indian. Seltzer's classifications, based on earlier work by Alice Hrdlicka and Paul Grota, has meanwhile been recognized as scientific racism in the vein of Samuel Morton's blatantly racist Crania Americana, which was published in 1839. And in that book, it proclaimed that the American Indian race is marked by a brown complexion, long, black, lank hair, and deficient of beard. In their mental character, the Americans are averse to cultivation. They're slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and they're fond of war, and they're wholly destitute of maritime adventure. Following Hrdlicka's 1920 text Anthropometry, like a field manual, Seltzer compared real hair from the Lumbee Indians to artificial hair to determine whether or not they had real American Indian hair. In a related test, Seltzer placed a pencil in the hair of the Lumbee. And after they shook their head vigorously from side to side, from mild to vigorous, the pencil remained in the hair with a determination that they must not be Native American.